The summer of 1875 was the hottest in Arizona Territory history, but Violet Zimmerman would remember it not for the scorching heat that withered crops and dried creek beds to cracked mud, but for the day she found a dying man on her doorstep and made the decision that would change her life forever. Her hands trembled as she dragged the unconscious cowboy across the threshold of her small homestead cabin, his body burning with fever, his clothes caked with blood and the dust of the trail. The sunrise had barely cracked the horizon when Violet discovered him. She'd risen early as always, stepping onto her porch with a steaming cup of coffee when she spotted the crumpled form of a man at the edge of her property. His horse stood nearby, loyally waiting despite its obvious exhaustion. Violet had rushed toward them both, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting to find yet another casualty of the lawless territory. "Mister, can you hear me?" Violet called, kneeling beside the man. His face was flushed with fever, a nasty wound visible through the torn fabric of his shirt. Blood had dried in dark patterns against the blue cotton. When he didn't respond, she made her decision instantly. She couldn't leave him to die in the dirt. It took all her strength to half drag, half carry him to her cabin. At 23, Violet was no fragile flower. 4 years of working her late father's homestead alone had hardened her muscles and toughened her resolve. But the cowboy was tall and solid, and by the time she managed to get him onto her bed, sweat poured down her face and back. His belongings told her little: a worn saddle, weathered saddlebags containing spare clothing, a small pouch of coins, ammunition for the revolver still holstered at his hip, and a letter addressed simply to Henry Donovan with no destination noted. The return address showed only Douglas Ranch, Tucson. "So that's your name, Henry Donovan," Violet murmured, setting the letter aside and turning her attention to his wound. A bullet had grazed his side, leaving a deep furrow that was angry and inflamed. The injury itself might not have been fatal, but the fever that had taken hold certainly could be. Violet worked methodically, cutting away his shirt with kitchen shears and cleaning the wound as best she could. She'd treated injuries before her own, and those of passing travelers who stopped at her small homestead for water from her precious well, but never anything this severe. "You're in for a fight, Mr. Donovan," she said as she applied a poultice of herbs she'd gathered and dried for medicinal purposes. Her mother had taught her which plants healed and which harmed, knowledge that proved invaluable on the frontier. Through that first day, Henry remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Violet bathed his forehead with cool water, changed his bandages, and tried to coax water between his cracked lips. When darkness fell, she settled into a chair beside the bed, determined to monitor his condition through the night. "Don't you die on me, cowboy," she whispered. "I didn't drag you in here just to dig you a grave." Violet lived alone, had done so since her father passed 4 years earlier when she was 19. Their nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, the kindly Prescott family who checked on her when they could, but had 5 children of their own to tend to. The town of Willow Creek lay 15 miles beyond that, a journey she made only when necessary for supplies. Independence was both her strength and her burden. Violet had learned to rely on herself, to fix what broke, to defend what was hers, but solitude exacted its toll. Sometimes weeks passed without conversation beyond the soft words she spoke to her mare, Penny, or the chickens that scratched in the yard. Now, watching the rise and fall of the cowboy's chest, Violet realized how strange it felt to have another human presence in her small home. Even unconscious, he filled the space in a way that made her aware of the silence she'd grown accustomed to. Dawn broke with no improvement. If anything, Henry's fever burned hotter and his breathing had become more labored. Violet changed the compress on his forehead and examined his wound again. The angry red streaks spreading from the injury confirmed her fear's infection was taking hold. "You need a doctor," she told him, knowing there was no way to fetch one. Dr. Matthews from town wouldn't make the journey unless absolutely necessary, and she couldn't leave Henry alone to ride for help. "But you've got me instead, so you'll just have to make do." She remembered her mother's remedy for infection, a bitter tea made from the bark of certain trees and wild garlic. Violet had some dried in her stores. She brewed a strong batch and, supporting Henry's head, carefully poured small amounts into his mouth, making sure he swallowed. By midday, his thrashing had become more violent. He muttered incoherently, names and places Violet didn't recognize. She caught fragments: ambush, cattle, brother, but nothing that told a complete story. Once, his hand gripped her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes flying open but seeing nothing before he collapsed back into fevered unconsciousness. As the second night approached, Violet feared she was watching him die. His skin burned impossibly hot, his breathing ragged. She'd done everything she knew to do, applied every remedy passed down through generations of frontier women. Now it seemed only prayer remained. "Please," she whispered to whoever might be listening, "give him strength, help him fight." She dozed fitfully in the chair beside him, waking at every sound. Near midnight, a crash of thunder shook the cabin as a summer storm broke over the parched land. Rain lashed against the windows, a blessing for the dry earth but an eerie backdrop to her vigil. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, ghostly flashes, casting Henry's features in stark relief. In those momentary glimpses, Violet saw a face that might once have been handsome before pain and fever ravaged it. A strong jaw dark with several days' growth of beard, a scar bisecting one eyebrow. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps late 20s or early 30s. Who was he? What had brought him, wounded and dying, to her doorstep? The letter offered no clues beyond a name and a possible connection to a ranch near Tucson, nearly 100 miles south. As the storm raged outside, Violet felt a strange kinship with this stranger. They were both alone, fighting elements beyond their control, he against whatever violence had wounded him and the infection now threatening his life. She against the harsh realities of surviving as a woman alone in unforgiving territory. The third day dawned with an unexpected change. Henry's fever, while still present, had diminished slightly. His breathing seemed less labored. When Violet changed his bandages, the angry red streaks hadn't spread further. A fragile hope took root in her heart. "That's it," she encouraged, though he couldn't hear. "Keep fighting." She used the rainwater collected overnight to bathe his face and chest, cooling his fevered skin. The storm had broken the worst of the heat, and fresh air flowed through the windows she'd opened. For the first time since finding him, Violet allowed herself to believe he might survive. That afternoon, she ventured briefly outside to tend to her neglected chores. Henry's horse had been given water and feed in her small stable alongside Penny. The chickens needed attention, and her vegetable garden required watering despite the recent rain. Working quickly, Violet kept glancing toward the cabin, worried about leaving Henry alone even for these necessary tasks. When she returned, his condition seemed unchanged. Violet prepared a thin broth, determined to get nourishment into him somehow. Supporting his head, she carefully spooned small amounts between his lips. To her encouragement, he swallowed reflexively. "Good," she murmured. "That's good, Henry." She continued talking as she worked, telling him about her homestead, about the years she'd spent here, first with her father and then alone after his passing. Words flowed easily to this unconscious listener, perhaps because he couldn't respond, couldn't judge. Violet spoke of things she rarely voiced aloud: her loneliness, her fears, her determination to keep her land despite the challenges. "Most folks think I should have sold and moved to town after Pa died," she told him while changing his compress, "or found a husband to take over. As if I couldn't possibly manage on my own." A small, defiant smile curved her lips. "But I've done just fine. This land was Pa's dream, but it's mine now. I won't give it up." Night fell, and Violet continued her vigil. She read aloud from one of her precious books by lamplight: Ivanhoe, a favorite she'd read countless times. Her voice grew hoarse, but she persisted, finding comfort in the familiar words and hoping somehow the sound might reach through Henry's fevered state. Exhaustion finally claimed her near midnight. She dozed in the chair, book still open in her lap, head tilted at an uncomfortable angle against the wooden back. "Water." The raspy voice jolted Violet awake. She blinked in confusion, disoriented from sleep, before realizing Henry's eyes were open, focused on her face. Water, he repeated, the word barely audible. Violet scrambled to fetch the cup she kept ready. Here, she said, supporting his head as she had so many times over the past days, but this time his eyes tracked her movements. Small sips. He drank greedily but coughed after only a few swallows. Violet pulled the cup away, warning, not too fast. Henry's eyes, a striking blue she hadn't noticed before, held hers for a long moment. Confusion creased his brow. Who? He began, but even that single word seemed to drain his limited strength. I'm Violet Zimmerman. This is my homestead. I found you collapsed near my property 3 days ago. Recognition flickered across his features. Shot, he managed. Yes, Violet confirmed. You were shot. The wound is healing, but you've had a terrible fever. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Violet feared he'd slipped back into unconsciousness. But then he spoke again, each word an effort. Thank you. You need more rest, she said, adjusting his blanket. The fever's broken, but you're still very weak. As she rose to return the cup to the table, his hand suddenly caught her wrist, the same motion he'd made during his delirium, but this time with awareness behind it. Don't leave yet, he whispered, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that struck Violet unexpectedly. Then, as if embarrassed by his own request, he added, Please. Violet settled back into her chair. I won't, she promised. I'm right here. Relief visibly washed over his features as his eyes drifted closed again. Within moments, his breathing deepened, but this time into natural sleep rather than fevered unconsciousness. Violet watched him, her mind racing with questions he was still too weak to answer. Who had shot him? Why had he ended up at her homestead, miles from any main trail? But those questions would wait. For now, the important thing was that Henry Donovan would live. Morning came with golden light spilling through the windows. Violet, who had finally moved to her pallet on the floor for a few hours of proper sleep, woke to find Henry watching her. Good morning, she said, pushing herself upright and smoothing her rumpled dress. How are you feeling? Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, he replied, his voice stronger than the previous night but still rough with disuse. But I gather that's an improvement. Violet couldn't help but smile at the dry humor. Considerably. You had me worried you wouldn't pull through. She moved to his side, professionally checking his forehead with the back of her hand. The fever was completely gone. Next, she examined his wound, which looked cleaner. The angry red streaks receded. You've got a good touch, Henry observed. Were you a nurse during the war? Violet shook her head. I was too young. This was my mother's knowledge. She learned from her mother and so on. Your husband doesn't mind you tending strange men, he asked, glancing around the cabin as if expecting someone else to appear. There is no husband, Violet replied matter-of-factly. I live alone. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. That's not common in these parts. Neither is surviving a gunshot and fever, she countered. Yet here you are. That drew a small smile from him. Fair point, Miss Zimmerman. Violet is fine, she said, moving to the stove. You should try to eat something. I'll make porridge. As she prepared the simple meal, Violet was acutely aware of his eyes following her movements. It had been a long time since she'd been observed so closely by another person, and it made her uncomfortably conscious of her appearance, her dark hair hastily braided, her dress wrinkled from sleeping in the chair. I owe you my life, Henry said quietly. Violet glanced over her shoulder. Anyone would have done the same. No, he contradicted. Not everyone would take in a stranger risk having a dying man in their home, especially not a woman alone. She brought 2 bowls to the bedside, setting one on the small table next to him. Can you sit up? Henry tried, wincing with the effort. Violet quickly moved to help, supporting his shoulders as he shifted into a more upright position. The brief contact made her uncomfortably aware of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders beneath the thin shirt she'd put on him after washing his bloodied one. Thank you, he said, accepting the bowl. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a momentary touch that shouldn't have registered but somehow did. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Henry spoke again. I should explain how I ended up bleeding on your doorstep, Violet nodded. If you're strong enough. Henry took a deep breath. I worked for the Douglas Ranch near Tucson. Was driving cattle north with several other men when we were ambushed 3 days ago about 20 miles south of here. Rustlers, I reckon, though they were more interested in killing than stealing. Were you the only survivor? Violet asked softly. Pain flashed across his features. I don't know, everything happened fast. Shots came from the rocks above the trail, my friends were falling. I took a bullet but managed to get to my horse. I remember riding hard, trying to find help. He shook his head. After that, it's all fragments until I woke to your voice. Your horse brought you here, Violet told him. He's in the stable, well tended, a loyal animal. Thunder, Henry said, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He's a good horse, better than I deserve, apparently. You need to rest, Violet said, noting the fatigue already pulling at his features. We can talk more later. Henry didn't argue, already sinking back against the pillows. You've been sleeping in that chair, he observed. Take your bed back, I can manage on the floor. Violet laughed outright at this. You can barely sit up to eat porridge and you think you're going to sleep on a hard floor? No, Mr. Donovan. The patient stays in the bed until he can walk across the room without assistance. Henry, he corrected, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. If I'm calling you Violet, then I'm Henry to you. Fine, Henry, she acquiesced. Now rest. As she took their empty bowls to wash, Violet found herself oddly flustered by the simple exchange of first names. Such familiarity shouldn't matter, she'd been tending to his unconscious body for days. After all, but now that he was awake, aware, speaking to her, everything felt different. Over the next few days, Henry's strength gradually returned. He progressed from sitting up in bed to taking tentative steps across the room with Violet's support. His color improved, and the wound began to heal cleanly. They fell into a routine of sorts, Violet tending to her homestead chores while Henry rested, then returning to change his bandages, prepare meals, and often read aloud in the evenings. They talked, too. Henry told her about his life born in Missouri, fought for the Union during the war despite being barely 18 when it ended, then drifted west seeking opportunity. He'd worked as a cowhand for various outfits before landing at the Douglas Ranch 2 years ago. It was the first place that felt something like home since before the war, he admitted one evening as Violet changed his bandage. Mr. Douglas is fair, treats his men well, his wife even has us for dinner on Sundays like we're family. They must be worried about you, Violet observed. Henry nodded, his expression troubled. And about the others? Joe Martinez, Bill Cooper, young Tommy Reed, just 17 and on his first cattle drive. His hands fisted in the blanket. I need to get word to them, find out if anyone else made it. When you're stronger, Violet promised. I could ride to town, send a telegram. I wouldn't ask you to make that journey alone, Henry said firmly. I've made it plenty of times, she reminded him, a hint of steel entering her voice. Henry studied her face. I don't doubt your capability, Violet. But those same men who ambushed us could still be in the area. I wouldn't put you at risk. The concern in his voice was genuine, and Violet found herself touched rather than offended. Then we'll wait until you can accompany me, she conceded, but that means you need to focus on healing. A week after Henry first regained consciousness, Violet returned from gathering eggs to find him standing on the porch, leaning against the railing. Sunlight caught in his hair, turning it a rich chestnut. He'd managed to shave with her father's old razor, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden beneath his beard. You shouldn't be up alone, she chided, though without real anger. Henry turned, offering a smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, carefree. The same four walls were closing in on me. Besides, I'm getting stronger every day thanks to your care. Violet set down her basket of eggs. Still, you could have fallen. Would you have caught me? He teased. The question, light as it was, caught Violet off guard. In the days of nursing him, a peculiar intimacy had developed between them, unavoidable given the circumstances. But this was different. This was Henry well enough to look at her with clear eyes, to smile, to tease. I might have let you fall as a lesson in patience, she retorted, recovering herself. Henry laughed, the sound warming something in Violet that had been cold for longer than she cared to admit. A hard teacher, Miss Zimmerman. The frontier doesn't reward the careless, Mr. Donovan. They shared a smile, And in that moment, Violet became acutely aware of how her life had changed in just over a week. The silence of her solitary existence had been filled with another voice, another presence. Her routine had expanded to include caring for Henry, talking with him, sharing meals across from someone rather than eating alone. And soon he would be well enough to leave. The thought struck her with unexpected force. Of course he would leave, return to the Douglas ranch, to his life. That had always been the outcome of this temporary arrangement. So why did the prospect suddenly feel like a loss, Violet? Henry's voice broke into her thoughts. Are you all right? She blinked, realizing she'd been staring. Yes, just thinking about what needs doing today. If he suspected there was more to her sudden distraction, he didn't press. Instead, he gestured to the chair beside him. Join me, it's a beautiful morning. Violet hesitated only briefly before sitting. The porch was small, the chairs close together. From here, they could see the expanse of her property, the vegetable garden she tended carefully, the chicken coop, the small corral where Penny and Thunder grazed companionably. You've built something remarkable here, Henry said after a comfortable silence. Most men couldn't manage a homestead this well, let alone a woman on her own. It was my father's dream, Violet explained. He brought us west when I was 14 after my mother died, said we needed a fresh start. She smiled at the memory. He was stubborn, determined. Wouldn't give up even when the first crops failed, when the well ran dry that second summer. You're his daughter in that respect, Henry observed. Violet glanced at him, surprised by the perception. Yes, I suppose I am. What was his plan for this place? Beyond survival, I mean. He wanted to expand eventually, raise cattle as well as crops, build a proper house to replace this cabin. Violet's gaze swept across the land, seeing not just what was but what her father had envisioned. He died before he could realize those dreams, thrown from his horse 4 years ago. I'm sorry, Henry said quietly. Everyone said I should sell, move to town, find a position as a shop girl or a seamstress, find a husband. Violet's chin lifted slightly. But this land was everything to him, to us. I couldn't just let it go. Henry studied her profile. So you stayed, alone. Yes, that took courage or stubbornness, Violet said with a small smile. Depends who you ask. Henry's hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was gentle but firm, unexpectedly intimate. I'm asking you. Violet met his gaze, finding something there that made her heart beat faster. Maybe both, she admitted softly. They sat together watching the sunrise fully crest the distant mountains, neither moving to break the contact of their hands. In that moment of shared quietude, something shifted between them, something neither was ready to name but both felt acutely. That evening, as they finished the rabbit stew Violet had prepared, Henry broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. I need to get word to the Douglas ranch soon. They need to know about the ambush, and, he hesitated, I've imposed on your hospitality far too long already. Violet kept her expression neutral despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. You're not well enough for that journey yet. No, Henry agreed, but I'm well enough to make it to town. From there I can send a telegram, perhaps arrange for transportation. I see. Violet stood, collecting their empty bowls with movements more brisk than necessary. Well, if you feel strong enough, we could ride to Willow Creek tomorrow. Violet, Henry's voice stopped her. Look at me, please. She turned reluctantly, finding him watching her with an intensity that made it difficult to maintain her composure. I'm not eager to leave, he said quietly, but I can't continue to burden you, and I have responsibilities. People who may be grieving for me, thinking I'm dead. Of course, Violet said, straightening her shoulders. I understand completely. It was never. That is, I always knew you would leave once you were recovered. Henry rose from his chair, moving toward her with only a slight stiffness betraying his healing wound. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that while I need to contact the ranch, I don't want. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration, then tried again. These past days, getting to know you, talking with you, it's meant something to me, Violet, more than I expected. Violet felt warmth spread through her chest, but caution held her words back. She'd been alone too long to trust easily, to believe that someone like Henry, handsome, capable with a life waiting elsewhere, could possibly be suggesting what she thought he might be. You've been recovering from a near-fatal wound, she said carefully. It's natural to feel a connection to the person who cared for you. Is that what you think this is? Henry asked, taking another step closer. Gratitude confused for something else, isn't it? No, the single word carried conviction. I was drawn to your voice before I even opened my eyes, Violet. When I was lost in fever, it was your words that guided me back. And every day since, I've discovered more reasons to admire you, your strength, your determination, your kindness. He was close enough now that she could see the varying shades of blue in his eyes, feel the warmth radiating from his body. I don't know what happens next, Henry continued softly. I have obligations I can't ignore, but I do know I'm not ready to say goodbye to you. Violet stood perfectly still, afraid to trust the hope building within her. What are you saying, Henry? I'm saying I care for you, that these feelings aren't born of gratitude alone, but something deeper. His hand rose to gently touch her cheek. And I hope you might feel something similar. The simple touch broke something loose in Violet, a dam holding back emotions she'd denied for years. Tears welled in her eyes, surprising them both. Violet, alarm colored Henry's voice. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have known, she interrupted, managing a watery smile. Don't apologize, it's been so long since anyone. She took a shaky breath. Since anyone saw me as more than just a stubborn woman who refuses to know her place. Understanding softened Henry's features. I see you, Violet Zimmerman, all of you, your strength and your vulnerability, your independence and your loneliness. His thumb gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. The tender gesture undid her further. I do care for you, she admitted in a whisper. But I'm afraid to believe this could be real. You have a life elsewhere, and I have only this. She gestured around the small cabin. We'll figure it out, Henry promised. Starting with that trip to town tomorrow, I'll send my telegram, let the ranch know I'm alive, and then. He smiled down at her. Then we can decide what comes next, together. The word together held such promise that Violet found herself nodding, a cautious hope blossoming within her. Together, she echoed. Henry's hands framed her face with infinite gentleness. May I kiss you, Violet? In answer, she rose on tiptoes, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared feeling. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as if afraid she might vanish. Violet's hands found their way to his shoulders, then the nape of his neck, fingers threading through his hair. When they finally parted, both breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first day I opened my eyes to see you. Violet smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. I believe that was when you could barely speak a full sentence. Didn't need words to know you were extraordinary, he murmured, pressing another quick kiss to her lips. That night, Henry returned to the bed while Violet took her pallet on the floor, but something fundamental had changed between them. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty but filled with possibility, with unspoken promises of a future neither had anticipated but both now yearned for. Dawn broke clear and bright, ideal for the journey to Willow Creek. Violet rose early, packing provisions for the day's ride. Henry joined her, moving with increasing confidence as his strength returned. You're healing well, Violet observed as he helped saddle the horses. Another week and you might not need my nursing skills anymore. Henry paused in adjusting Thunder's saddle to look at her. I may not need your medical attention, but I'll still need you, Violet. The simple declaration warmed her from within. You hardly know me, she reminded him, though without conviction. I know enough, Henry replied. I know you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. I know that when I think about riding away from here from you, it feels wrong. Before Violet could respond, he continued, but I understand your caution. We have time to learn each other better. I'm not asking for promises yet, just a chance. Violet nodded, a smile blooming across her face. A chance sounds reasonable, Mr. Donovan. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, riding side by side along the trail toward town. The journey would take several hours, and they passed the time sharing stories. Henry about his years drifting from ranch to ranch, Violet about her childhood in St. Louis before her father brought her west. I hated it at first, she admitted. Missed the city, my friends, cried myself to sleep that first year. What changed? Henry asked. Violet considered the question. I did, I suppose. Started seeing the beauty in this place, the vastness of the sky, the way the land changes with the seasons. Started feeling the freedom in it. Henry nodded, understanding. That's what drew me west too, the openness, the possibility. The conversation flowed easily between them, cementing Violet's growing certainty that what she felt for Henry wasn't merely the product of isolation or the intimate circumstances of nursing him back to health. There was a genuine connection here, something real and promising. They reached Willow Creek shortly after noon, the small town bustling with its usual activity. Violet was acutely aware of the curious glances thrown their way. A woman alone was unusual enough to draw attention, but a woman accompanied by a handsome stranger generated even more interest. The telegraph office is there, Violet said, pointing to a small building on the main street. And we should stop at the general store. I have eggs and preserves to trade for supplies. Henry nodded, dismounting carefully and tying Thunder to the hitching post. He came around to help Violet down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. The touch sent a flutter of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the public setting. Thank you, she murmured, conscious of watching eyes. Miss Zimmerman, called a familiar voice. Violet turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, approaching with barely concealed curiosity. How unexpected to see you in town today, and with company no less. Violet managed a polite smile. Mrs. Henderson, this is Henry Donovan. He was injured near my property, and I've been helping him recover. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Is that so? All alone at your homestead? My goodness, what would your father say? Before Violet could respond, Henry stepped forward, his manner respectful but firm. Madam, Miss Zimmerman saved my life. Her conduct has been nothing but proper and compassionate. I owe her a debt I can never repay. The older woman seemed taken aback by his direct address. Well, I'm sure she was only doing a Christian duty, she said, her tone softening slightly. Though you really should have brought him to town, dear. Dr. Matthews could have tended him, and you wouldn't have risked your reputation. My reputation is less important than a man's life, Mrs. Henderson, Violet replied evenly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have business at the telegraph office. She moved past the woman, Henry following close behind. Once out of earshot, he murmured, I apologize if my presence has complicated things for you. Violet shook her head. Mrs. Henderson would find something to disapprove of regardless. Don't concern yourself. At the telegraph office, Henry composed a message to the Douglas ranch, informing them of his survival, the ambush, and his current whereabouts. While he handled this, Violet crossed to the general store to trade her goods and purchase necessary supplies. She was examining a bolt of fabric when a familiar figure approached William Parker, the town's most prosperous rancher and a man who had made his interest in her clear on several occasions. Miss Zimmerman, he greeted, removing his hat. A pleasure to see you in town. Mr. Parker, Violet acknowledged with a nod. I was beginning to worry about you, he said, moving closer. It's been, 2 months since you last came to town. I've been occupied with the homestead, she replied neutrally. William was not an unkind man, but his persistent attention made her uncomfortable. At 40, he was considerably older than Violet, and his interest seemed centered more on her land than on her as a person. A woman shouldn't have to manage alone, he said, a familiar refrain. My offer still stands, you know. You'd want for nothing as my wife, and your father's land would be well tended. Before Violet could formulate a polite rejection, she sensed a presence at her side. Henry stood there, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes assessing the situation with quick intelligence. Excuse the interruption, he said smoothly. The telegraph has been sent, Violet. William's eyes narrowed at the familiar use of her first name. And who might you be? Henry Donovan, he replied, extending his hand. A friend of Miss Zimmerman's. William shook the offered hand with obvious reluctance. William Parker, I own the Double P Ranch east of town. Mr. Parker has been very attentive since my father's passing, Violet explained to Henry, a hint of dry humor in her voice that only he would catch. Henry's lips twitched slightly. Is that so? Miss Zimmerman's situation is precarious, William stated. A woman alone can't properly manage a homestead, regardless of how capable she believes herself to be. I've offered her a solution that would benefit us both. How generous, Henry commented, his tone giving nothing away, but from what I've seen, Miss Zimmerman manages admirably. William's jaw tightened. You're not from around here. A passing acquaintance hardly qualifies you to judge her circumstances. Perhaps not, Henry conceded, but I know quality when I see it. The tension between the two men was palpable. Violet decided to intervene before the situation escalated. Mr. Parker, thank you as always for your concern. Mr. Donovan and I should finish our business if we hope to return to the homestead before dark. William looked as if he might argue further, but finally nodded curtly. Of course. Remember what I said, Miss Zimmerman. My offer won't remain open indefinitely. As he walked away, Henry turned to Violet with raised eyebrows. Charming fellow. Violet couldn't suppress a small laugh. He means well in his way. He sees a woman alone, land that could be absorbed into his ranch, and a straightforward solution. And you've never been tempted by his proposal? Henry asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Never, Violet confirmed without hesitation. I'd rather struggle alone than be a convenient addition to a man's property. Something in Henry's expression softened. You deserve far better than convenience, Violet. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. For a moment, they stood looking at each other, oblivious to the curious glances from other customers. The spell was broken by the shopkeeper clearing his throat. Will there be anything else, Miss Zimmerman? They completed their purchases and left the store, loading supplies onto their horses. As they prepared to depart, Dr. Matthews emerged from his office across the street, spotting them immediately. Miss Zimmerman, he called, crossing to them. And who's this? Violet made the introductions, explaining briefly about Henry's injury. The doctor insisted on examining the wound before they left town, ushering them into his office despite Henry's protests that he was healing well. Miss Zimmerman is skilled with herbal remedies, Dr. Matthews acknowledged after examining Henry, but gunshot wounds are serious business. You're fortunate the bullet only grazed you and didn't become lodged in the muscle. I'm well aware of my good fortune, Henry replied, his eyes finding Violet's across the room. The doctor noted the exchange with interest. Yes, well, the wound is healing cleanly. Continue changing the bandages daily for another week. No strenuous activity. They thanked him and departed, aware that news of their visit would spread quickly through the small community. Violet found she cared less about the gossip than she might have expected. Something fundamental had shifted in her priorities, in her view of her future. As they rode out of town, Henry broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. I received a reply to my telegram. The ranch foreman, Johnson, confirmed that 2 of the men with me survived the ambush. Martinez and Cooper. They made it back to the ranch with injuries but are recovering. That's wonderful news, Violet said sincerely. Yes, Henry agreed, though his expression remained troubled. Young Tommy didn't make it though, just 17. Violet reached across the space between their horses to touch his arm gently. I'm sorry, Henry, he nodded acknowledgement. Johnson also said they've organized a posse to track down the men responsible. They believe it was the Carson gang known rustlers who have been causing trouble throughout the territory. Did they ask you to join them? Violet questioned, sensing there was more to his pensive mood. They've requested I return as soon as I'm able, Henry confirmed. Not just for the posse, but because we're short-handed with the injured men and those we lost. Violet felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Of course they wanted him back. He had obligations, responsibilities. The connection growing between them couldn't erase those facts. When will you go? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Henry looked at her directly. I told Johnson I needed time to recover fully, that I'd return in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Violet repeated softly, such a short time to explore what was developing between them. To determine if these feelings could withstand reality once Henry was fully healed and no longer dependent on her care. Violet, Henry said, guiding Thunder closer to Penny so their legs nearly touched as they rode. I meant what I said earlier. I'm not ready to say goodbye to you. But you have obligations, she pointed out. A job, people counting on you. Yes, he acknowledged. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way forward together if that's what we both want. The if hung between them, a question neither was quite ready to answer definitively. Violet found herself both terrified and exhilarated by the possibilities stretching before them, possibilities she had long since stopped allowing herself to consider. They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in thought. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as they approached Violet's homestead. The familiar sight of her small cabin, the garden she tended so carefully, the chicken coop and stable, all of it suddenly looked different to Violet. No longer just her solitary domain, but a place where something unexpected had taken root. That evening, after tending to the horses and preparing a simple meal, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken eventually by Henry's quiet voice. "I've been thinking about what happens after these 2 weeks," he said. Violet turned to look at him, her heart quickening. "And I have to return to the Douglas ranch," he stated, confirming what she already knew. "I owe them that much, at least temporarily," but he shifted to face her more directly. "I don't want that to be the end of what's begun between us. What are you suggesting?" Violet asked, hardly daring to hope. "That you give me time to fulfill my obligations to help catch the men who killed my friends." Henry reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "And then, if you're willing, I'd like to come back. Not as a patient this time, but as a man who cares deeply for you and wants to see where this might lead." Violet looked down at their joined hands. "You make it sound so simple." "It won't be," Henry acknowledged. "Nothing worthwhile ever is. But I believe what's happening between us is worth pursuing. And if it doesn't work," Violet voiced her deepest fear, "if you return to your life and realize these feelings were just circumstantial," Henry considered her words seriously. "I can't promise the future, Violet, no one can. But I know myself well enough to recognize when something real has entered my life." His thumb traced gentle patterns across her knuckles. "You're not a passing fancy or a convenient comfort. You're a remarkable woman who's captured my heart in ways I never expected." The sincerity in his voice, in his eyes, was unmistakable. Violet found herself wanting desperately to believe him, to trust in the possibility he offered. "2 weeks isn't much time," she murmured. "No," Henry agreed, "but it's enough to build foundations. The rest we can construct together day by day." Violet searched his face, finding only openness and genuine feeling there. Slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. 2 weeks to see what might be possible between us. And then I'll return to the Douglas ranch, but only to settle matters there," Henry finished. "With your permission, I'd come back to you as soon as I could." "To visit?" Violet asked, needing clarity. Henry's expression grew more serious. "Initially, perhaps. But ultimately, Violet, if what I'm feeling continues to grow as I believe it will, I'd come back to stay, if you'll have me." The implication of future together, a shared life, took Violet's breath away. It was too soon for such discussions, too early to make such plans. And yet she couldn't deny the rightness she felt at the idea, the sense that Henry Donovan's unexpected arrival in her life might be the beginning of something profound. "Let's begin with these 2 weeks," she suggested, not ready to commit to more despite the hope blossoming in her chest. "See where they lead us." Henry nodded, accepting her caution. 2 weeks, he agreed. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Beginning now." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Violet. Henry's recovery continued steadily, his strength returning more each day. Soon he was able to help with chores around the homestead, chopping wood, mending the chicken coop, repairing a leak in the roof that had plagued Violet for months. They fell into a rhythm together, working side by side during the day, talking late into the evening. Violet found herself sharing thoughts and dreams she'd kept private for years, her hopes for expanding the homestead, her occasional loneliness, her fears for the future. Henry listened without judgment, offering his own confidences in return. Physical awareness hummed between them, growing stronger as Henry regained his health. Their touches lingered, their gazes held. Kisses that began tentatively grew deeper, more urgent, though both maintained a boundary neither was ready to cross. On the third night after their trip to town, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie. Wind rattled the cabin's shutters as rain lashed against the windows. Henry found Violet standing by the door, watching the storm's fury with a mixture of appreciation and concern. "Will your garden survive?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "It usually does," she replied. "The rain is welcome even if it comes with such force." Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating everything in stark relief. In that brief, brilliant flash, Henry saw something in Violet's expression, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to show. "What is it?" he asked softly. Violet hesitated, then admitted, "Storms like this. They remind me how small we are, how easily everything we build can be swept away." Henry understood she wasn't speaking only of physical structures. "That's true," he acknowledged, "but it also shows how resilient we can be, rebuilding, persisting." Another lightning flash, another crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Violet unconsciously moved closer to Henry, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I've been alone for so long," she whispered. "Convinced myself it was what I wanted, what I needed to be." "And now," Henry prompted gently. Violet turned in his embrace to face him, her eyes searching his. "Now I'm afraid of wanting something different, of believing in possibilities that might vanish as quickly as they appeared." "I'm not going to vanish, Violet," Henry promised. "When I leave in 11 days, it won't be an ending." "How can you be so certain?" she asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Henry insisted. "I know how you talk to your mare as if she understands every word. I know you save the crusts from your bread to feed the birds. I know you read the same page 3 times when you're tired but too stubborn to stop." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "I know the exact shade of your eyes when you're amused but trying not to show it." Violet's breath caught at the tenderness in his voice, the specificity of his observations. "I know you're brave and fierce and gentle," Henry continued, "and I know that finding you even through such painful circumstances feels like the most fortunate accident of my life." Tears welled in Violet's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelmed emotion. "I'm afraid to believe you," she admitted. "Afraid to trust this feeling." "I understand fear," Henry said quietly. "I've spent years moving from place to place, never allowing myself to form attachments that might hurt when severed, but sometimes, Violet, the risk is worth taking." As if to emphasize his words, he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that spoke of longing and promise. Violet responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you, Violet Zimmerman," he whispered. "Probably have been since you first spoke to me through the fever. I don't expect you to say it back yet. Just know that's where my heart stands." The declaration, simple and direct, pierced through Violet's carefully constructed defenses. Part of her wanted to retreat, to protect herself from the vulnerability such feelings created. But a stronger part recognized the truth in her own heart. "I think I might be falling in love with you too," she admitted softly. "And it terrifies me." Henry's smile was gentle, understanding. "We can be terrified together then." The storm raged on outside, but within the small cabin, a different kind of storm was calming the tumultuous uncertainty, giving way to something steadier, more sure. The next several days passed in a blend of practical work and deepening connection. Violet showed Henry the full extent of her property, including the creek that ran along the western boundary and the small grove of trees her father had planted as a windbreak. Henry listened attentively as she outlined her plans for expansion, additional crops, perhaps a few cattle when she could afford them. "Your father would be proud," Henry told her as they stood surveying the land. "Not many could have preserved his dream as you have, let alone expanded upon it." "I hope so," Violet replied, warmth spreading through her at his understanding. "Sometimes I worry I'm being stubborn for the wrong reasons, holding onto this place out of obligation rather than true desire." Henry considered this. "And what does your heart tell you?" Violet looked across the land, her land with its particular beauty and challenges. "That this is home," she said simply. That despite the difficulties, I love it here. Then you're not being stubborn, Henry assured her. You're being true to yourself. As they walked back toward the cabin, Henry shared his own experiences with the Douglas ranch, the camaraderie among the cowhands, the satisfaction of work well done, the sense of belonging he'd found there. It sounds like a good place, Violet observed. It is, Henry agreed. The closest thing to a home I've had in years. The unspoken question hung between them: how could he reconcile his attachment to the ranch with his growing feelings for Violet? Neither had a clear answer yet, but the conversation opened a door to possibilities they might explore together. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a rider appeared on the horizon. Violet tensed immediately, her hand moving instinctively toward the rifle kept just inside the door. "Stay here," Henry said, rising to his feet. "It's my property," Violet reminded him, standing as well. "We'll both see who it is." The rider approached at a steady pace, eventually revealing himself as a young man in the dusty clothing of a ranch hand. When he reached the cabin, he tipped his hat respectfully. "Miss Zimmerman?" he inquired. "Yes," Violet confirmed cautiously. "Name's Jackson, madam, from the Douglas Ranch." His eyes shifted to Henry with obvious relief. "Mr. Donovan, sir, foreman sent me to check on you, make sure you were recovering well." Henry stepped forward. "That's good of Johnson. As you can see, I'm much improved, thanks to Miss Zimmerman's care." Jackson nodded, clearly uncomfortable with his next message. "Foreman also sent word that the posse tracked the Carson gang. There was a shootout 2 days ago near the border. They got most of them, but 2 escaped." He hesitated. "Tommy Reed's father was with them. He's asking when you'll be returning, sir. Says he wants to hear exactly what happened to his boy." Henry's expression tightened with renewed grief and responsibility. "Of course. Please tell Mr. Reed I'll return as soon as I'm able to make the journey." "Another week, perhaps?" "Yes, sir." Jackson's eyes darted between Henry and Violet, clearly noting their proximity and drawing his own conclusions. "Foreman also said to tell you your position is secure whenever you're ready to come back." "Thank him for me," Henry replied. After declining an offer to stay the night in favor of making it to the nearest town before full dark, Jackson departed, leaving Henry and Violet standing in the yard watching his retreating form. "You should go with him," Violet said quietly. "Mr. Reed shouldn't have to wait to hear about his son." Henry turned to her, surprise and conflict evident in his expression. "Violet, I know what we said about 2 weeks," she continued, "but that father deserves answers. You're well enough to travel now, even if you can't resume full duties yet." Henry studied her face. "Are you trying to hurry me on my way?" "No," Violet answered honestly, "but I understand obligations, Henry, family, loss. If that were my father seeking answers about me, I'd want whoever could provide them to come quickly." The understanding in her voice, the selflessness of her suggestion, only deepened Henry's growing feelings for her. "You're right," he acknowledged reluctantly. "I should go sooner than planned." Violet nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest at the prospect of his imminent departure. "You can leave tomorrow. I'll help you prepare." "Violet," Henry said firmly, taking her hands in his, "this doesn't change anything between us. I'm still coming back." She managed a small smile. "I know, but you should see to your responsibilities first. Make peace with Mr. Reed, help finish the business with the Carson gang if you can. And then," Henry prompted, needing to hear her say it. Violet took a deep breath, committing herself to the future they were tentatively building. "And then come back to me, Henry Donovan, if that's truly what you want." "It is," he assured her without hesitation. "More than anything." That night, knowing it would be their last together for some time, neither Henry nor Violet could sleep. They sat before the fireplace, talking of everything and nothing, reluctant to waste a moment in slumber. "Tell me about your dreams," Henry requested. "Not just for this land, but for yourself." Violet considered the question thoughtfully. "I suppose I've focused so much on survival these past years that dreams seemed like luxuries I couldn't afford." She paused, then admitted, "But sometimes I've imagined a fuller life here, children playing in that grove of trees. A proper house with glass windows and a stone chimney. With a husband who appreciates your strength rather than trying to diminish it," Henry added softly. "Yes," Violet agreed, meeting his gaze. Someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession. Is that how you see me, Violet? As that kind of man, the vulnerability in his question touched her deeply. Yes, Henry, I do. Relief and joy transformed his features. Good, because that's exactly what I want to be for you. They stayed up until dawn, reluctant to waste precious hours in sleep. When the first light of morning streaked the sky, they moved outside to watch the sunrise together, Henry's arm around Violet's shoulders, her head resting against him. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, the question she'd been avoiding all night. "A month, perhaps," Henry estimated. "Time to help finish tracking the remaining gang members, to properly honor Tommy and the others we lost, to settle my affairs at the ranch." Violet nodded, absorbing this. "A month. I'll write," Henry promised, "and I'll return the moment I can." "I know," Violet said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. A month was a long time, long enough for circumstances to change, for feelings to cool, for reality to intrude upon what might simply be a romantic interlude born of extraordinary circumstances. As if reading her thoughts, Henry turned her to face him. "I meant what I said before, Violet. I'm falling in love with you. Distance won't change that." "I believe you," Violet said, and realized with some surprise that she did. Something about Henry Donovan inspired trust, despite her years of careful self-reliance. The preparations for his departure were made quickly but thoroughly. Violet packed provisions for his journey, checked Thunder's shoes, and mended a tear in Henry's saddlebag. Each practical task helped distract from the ache building in her chest. Too soon it was time. Henry stood beside Thunder, all his belongings secured, nothing left but goodbye. "This isn't an ending," he reminded her, taking her hands in his. "I know," Violet said, summoning a brave smile. "1 month," Henry promised. "Then I'll be back if you'll still have me." In answer, Violet rose on tiptoes and kissed him with all the feeling she couldn't quite put into words. Henry responded with equal fervor, his arms encircling her waist and lifting her slightly off the ground. When they parted, both breathless, Henry pressed his forehead to hers. "That's something to remember on the trail. Be safe," Violet whispered. "Come back to me." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Henry vowed. With one last kiss, he mounted Thunder and turned the horse toward the south. Violet stood watching until horse and rider disappeared over the horizon, the morning sun casting their silhouette in gold before they vanished from sight. The cabin seemed unbearably quiet that night. Violet moved through her familiar routines, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, preparing a simple meal, but everything felt hollow without Henry's presence. She hadn't realized how quickly she'd grown accustomed to his company, his voice, his laughter. To combat the silence, she read aloud from Ivanhoe as she had during Henry's illness, finding comfort in the familiar words. It was a poor substitute for conversation, but it helped fill the emptiness. Days passed, becoming a week, then 2. Violet threw herself into work, expanding her garden, repairing fences, even beginning preparations for the small cattle pen she'd discussed with Henry. Physical labor helped exhaust her enough to sleep at night, when memories of Henry's touch, his kiss, his promise to return were most vivid. In the 3rd week after his departure, a letter arrived via a passing cattle driver who'd come to water his herd at her well. Violet's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, recognizing Henry's handwriting on the outside. "My dearest Violet," it began. The letter detailed his safe arrival at the Douglas Ranch, the emotional meeting with Tommy Reed's father, and the ongoing search for the remaining members of the Carson gang. But it was the personal passages that Violet read and reread until she had them memorized. "Every night I look at the stars and know you see the same ones, though from miles away. Every morning I wake thinking of your smile, your strength, your kindness. The ranch continues as always, but I find my thoughts constantly returning to a small homestead and the remarkable woman who saved more than just my life, who showed me a future I never dared imagine for myself. I've spoken with Mr. Douglas about my intentions. He understands, though he's reluctant to lose me. I've promised to help train my replacement before I leave permanently. This may extend my absence longer than the month I estimated, perhaps by another 2 weeks. The thought of this delay pains me, but I want to leave here honorably, with all obligations fulfilled. Know that every day away from you feels longer than the last. Know that my feelings grow stronger rather than dimmer with distance. Know that I am coming back to you, Violet, with hopes for a future together if you still desire it as much as I do. The letter was signed simply, "With all my heart, Henry." Violet pressed the pages to her chest, tears of relief and longing mingling on her cheeks. He hadn't forgotten. His feelings hadn't cooled. He was coming back. She wrote a reply immediately, pouring her heart onto the page in a way she never could have done face to face. She told him of her daily activities, of her progress on the homestead improvements, of her plans for the future. And she confessed, with trembling honesty, how deeply she had come to care for him and how eagerly she awaited his return. The letter was collected by the mail coach that passed 10 miles from her property each week. Violet rode there herself to ensure it would begin its journey to Henry without delay. The weeks stretched on. A second letter arrived from Henry, then a third. Each contained news of his progress settling affairs at the ranch, updates on the capture of the final members of the Carson gang, and increasingly explicit declarations of his feelings for her. In his most recent letter, he wrote, "I've secured a small herd of cattle, just 10 head to start, but healthy stock that will serve as a good foundation for breeding. Mr. Douglas has given them as partial payment for my years of service. I hope this meets with your approval, as they're intended for our future. Violet, the one I pray you still wish to build with me. Our future." The words sent a thrill through Violet unlike anything she'd experienced before. The solitary existence she'd maintained for years was transforming into something richer, more expansive, not through the surrender of her independence, but through the sharing of it with someone who valued her exactly as she was. 6 weeks after Henry's departure, 2 weeks longer than his original estimate, Violet spotted a dust cloud on the horizon one late afternoon. Shading her eyes against the setting sun, she watched as it resolved into the shapes of riders and cattle moving steadily toward her homestead. Her heart leaped into her throat. She hadn't expected Henry for at least another week, according to his last letter. Rushing inside, she quickly washed her face and hands, smoothed her hair, and changed into her cleanest dress before hurrying back outside. The small herd came into clear view, driven by 3 riders. Violet recognized Henry immediately, his familiar silhouette causing her pulse to quicken. Beside him rode an older man and a younger one, presumably helping with the cattle drive. Violet stood by the gate, waiting as they approached. Henry spotted her and urged thunder ahead of the herd, covering the remaining distance at a gallop. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with an eagerness that matched the expression on his face. "Violet," he breathed, crossing to her in long strides. She moved to meet him, propriety forgotten as she flung herself into his arms. Henry caught her, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of weeks of longing. "You're early," she managed when he set her down, though he kept his arms around her waist. "Couldn't wait another day," Henry admitted, his eyes drinking in the sight of her as if memorizing every detail anew. "I've missed you," Violet said simply, "and I you, more than I have words to express." He glanced back at the approaching cattle and riders. "I've brought my promises with me, the beginning of the herd we discussed, and my permanent return, if you'll still have me." Violet's answer was in her eyes, shining with tears of joy, and in the kiss she pressed to his lips, heedless of their audience. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Yes, I'll have you, Henry Donovan." The older rider cleared his throat pointedly as he approached, a mixture of amusement and embarrassment on his weathered face. Henry reluctantly released Violet, though he kept one arm around her waist as he made introductions. "Violet, this is Jim Douglas, my former employer, and this is Peter Reed, Tommy's brother. They insisted on helping me drive these troublesome beasts all the way from Tucson." "Welcome to my home, gentlemen," Violet greeted them, regaining her composure. "You must be exhausted after such a journey. Please come inside once the cattle are secured. I'll prepare a meal." While the men settled the small herd in the newly constructed pen, Violet hurried to prepare food worthy of guests. Her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks, Henry's presence filling the cabin with the energy she'd missed so desperately. After a hearty meal, Mr. Douglas and young Reed excused themselves to sleep in the stable, tactfully giving Henry and Violet privacy for their reunion. Once alone, they sat before the fire, Henry's arm around Violet's shoulders, her head resting against him as if they'd never been parted. "I was beginning to fear you wouldn't come back," Violet admitted softly. Henry tilted her face up to his. "Nothing could have prevented it," he assured her. "Every day away from you felt wrong, incomplete." "I felt the same," Violet confessed. "This place, even with all its meaning to me, felt empty without you." Henry took both her hands in his expression growing serious. "Violet Zimmerman, I've had weeks of writing to think about what I want to say to you in this moment. Weeks to consider whether what we began in such unusual circumstances could withstand separation and reflection." Violet held her breath, though the love in his eyes reassured her. "My feelings haven't changed," Henry continued, "except to grow deeper, more certain." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Violet. I want to build a life with you here, if you'll have me not as a temporary arrangement, but as your husband." Though she'd anticipated this moment from his letters, from his return with the cattle, the actual words still sent a shock of joy through her. "I love you too, Henry," Violet replied, her voice steady despite the emotions welling within her. "And yes, I want to be your wife." Henry's smile was radiant as he reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "I stopped in Tucson before we left," he explained, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Violet interrupted, extending her trembling hand. Henry slipped the ring onto her finger, then brought her hand to his lips, kissing it reverently. "When I woke from that fever and saw you for the first time," he murmured, "I had no idea I was looking at my future, but something in me recognized you, Violet. Something in me already knew." "I think perhaps I knew too," Violet admitted. "Why else would I have begged a stranger not to die on my doorstep?" Henry laughed softly, drawing her closer. "Thank God you did." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their promises, their shared future stretching before them, no longer a solitary existence for either, but a partnership built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. Mr. Douglas and Peter Reed departed the next morning, but not before Douglas had given the couple his blessing, and Reed had expressed his gratitude to Violet for saving Henry's life and, by extension, providing the comfort of knowing exactly what had happened to his brother. In the weeks that followed, Henry and Violet fell into an easy rhythm together. They expanded the cattle pen, planted additional crops, and made plans for a larger house to replace the small cabin. They were married by the minister in Willow Creek, a simple ceremony attended by the Prescott family and, surprisingly, William Parker, who offered grudging congratulations and a generous wedding gift of additional cattle. 2 years later, on a summer day even hotter than the one when Henry had first arrived at her doorstep, Violet sat on the porch of their new home, larger than the cabin but still modest, built by Henry's hands with help from neighbors. Beside her, Henry held their 6-month-old daughter, Catherine, named for Violet's mother. "She has your eyes," Henry observed, not for the first time, as the baby gurgled happily in his arms. "And your stubborn chin," Violet replied with a smile, reaching out to touch the infant's soft cheek. From this vantage point, they could see the expanded cattle herd grazing peacefully, the thriving crops, the chicken coop now 3 times its original size. What had once been Violet's solitary struggle for survival had transformed into a prosperous small ranch, built by their combined efforts. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Violet asked, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. "If you hadn't been wounded, if you hadn't found your way here?" Henry considered this, his free arm sliding around her shoulders. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember something my father used to say, that life has a way of steering us where we need to go, even when the path seems darkest." "Wise man," Violet murmured, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "I'd like to think he'd be proud," Henry said softly. "Of the life we've built, of the family we've become." "I know my father would be," Violet replied with certainty. "This was his dream, but we've made it so much more." Catherine began to fuss, hungry for her evening meal. As Violet took her from Henry's arms, she caught her husband watching them with such naked love that it still had the power to take her breath away, even after years together. "What?" she asked, smiling under his intent gaze. "Just thinking how fortunate I am," Henry replied. "That day when fever nearly took my life, I found something far greater than mere survival. I found you, Violet. I found home." As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing their land in the golden light of evening, Violet silently echoed the sentiment. From the most desperate of beginnings, a wounded stranger and a woman alone, they had forged a life rich with purpose, with love, with family. The journey hadn't been easy, but as Violet nursed their daughter in the growing twilight, Henry's hand resting gently on her shoulder, she knew with absolute certainty this was exactly where they were meant to be together.